Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Parks and Restoration Podcast, the show for parks and conservation leaders that want to be better leaders for their communities, their agencies, and future generations. I'm Chris Lee, the Executive Director at Des Moines County Conservation, coming to you today from the east coast of Iowa, where the Mississippi River is still frozen, even though it's 40 plus degrees outside, with 50s coming in the 7-day forecast. So I'm excited about that.
And I'm your West Coaster, Jeremy Yost, on the Natural Areas Management team here in Pottawatomie County Conservation. I actually took a little bit of time off of work yesterday to go ice fishing, which just felt wrong. It was like 60 degrees and I was sitting on like 8 inches of ice fishing.
Nice.
It's just like the weather cannot make up its mind right now.
I know. I love those days when it warms up after it's been cold and you can just go sit out on the ice when it's super nice out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was such a weird feeling to have my chair like literally melting into the ice.
Yeah, I know. I'm a little concerned. We have an ice fishing clinic or an ice fishing whatever event coming up next weekend on Valentine's Day, and I'm really hoping that the ice doesn't get too crappy between now and then. As much, I'll take the 60-degree weather if that's what it takes. If we got to cancel an event to have 60-degree weather, that's fine. I'll take that. But nevertheless, just kind of looking forward to seeing that event. Anyway, today we're talking about the economic value of the outdoors and how there seems to be this ever-growing push to put a dollar value on everything we do as parks and conservation leaders, parks and conservation professionals, whether it's maintaining habitat for wildlife or building parks or whatever it is. There's always this underlying question like what's the ROI? How much revenue is that going to generate, or how do we justify that in grant requests or in budget allocation requests? And I thought we'd take some time to kind of dig into that and just see, because I think there's some issues. There's some value in it for sure, but I see a lot of issues and just wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit about how maybe we as parks and conservation leaders could help kind of steer that narrative some in our own communities.
Yeah, I think this came to mind for me too, because we're in the thick of hiring our crew lead and our intern positions for this summer. And it seems like more and more often we're getting these kids that are coming from college and they're talking about this idea of ecosystem services. It's like, what is the service that like a prairie or trees, what service are they providing back to us as humans? And really it got me thinking, like, does it need to serve us? Or is there something else that's just intrinsic that it's okay for it to just be there without serving us?
Yeah. So let's dig into that some. So when they say ecosystem services, I imagine they're talking about, the pollinators and the water quality improvements that come from that. And then that could be measured in a dollars and cents standpoint from, say, water treatment facilities. So if water's falling on the ground, infiltrating, getting cleaned up before it makes to a water treatment facility, it's cheaper to then treat that water to provide through municipal utilities. So Des Moines is certainly up against this situation where they've had to literally ration water. They've had to put water restrictions in last year because the nitrate levels were so high that their multi-million-dollar system couldn't keep up with it, and so they told people you couldn't water your grass anymore. So is that what you mean by that, or is that what they're talking about when you're talking about ecosystem services?
Yeah, exactly. That's usually what comes up is, like if we're planting prairie, that has to be this like other reason for it. Just like you said, a reason maybe it's filtering out that water and filtering out those nitrates so that they don't have to be cleaned later. Or maybe it's something like pollinators, like you just said, like one third or 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we have is directly there because it was pollinated by a pollinator. And so if we have like these other areas out there next to this food that's prairie, it's this like area that's only there to serve those pollinators that serve us, but can it be there just because it's supposed to be?
So I guess that begs the question, like, what is the intrinsic value of things? If we can't put, say, a dollar value or a service value on them, and like I think we get mixed up in just the whole idea of value of like the term value indicates that there's some benefit to us as humans. But what if it was the case where value isn't that there is value beyond just an impact on us or a benefit to us. And so that gets to that philosophical question of what's the intrinsic value of nature or natural things, or that which is natural, wild, and free, the way Aldo Leopold put it. And so I don't know. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that?
So when I think about that, I think about like back to our why, that our why is that we want to provide opportunities for people to recreate, learn, and connect with a thriving natural system. And so like these things still revolve around people, but it's not monetized. It's not like this ecosystem service that we have to put a dollar figure on. It can be something that when you have that ability to connect with nature, maybe it's just mental health. Maybe it's just learning about the Loess Hills. Maybe it's learning about the Mississippi River floodplain. It doesn't have to revolve back to money, I don't think.
So let me push on that a little bit. What if it was something that doesn't have direct contact with people? So, for instance, down here, a lot of the talk here lately, because we have a proposal for a wind turbine wind farm development here in our county. A lot has been talked about endangered species, and we know we have endangered species of bats because we've been doing monitoring on bats for over a decade now. And we know we have all species of bats known to Iowa in some of our parks, Big Hollow being one of them, which would be the closest park to this proposed wind farm development. And that includes the 3 species that are on the endangered species list, Indiana bass being one of them. So investment in something like that. So, investments in protecting threatened or endangered species of bats. What's the value? What's the ROI on that? Like, I mean, as conservationists, we know what that is, right? I mean, this is what we do all the time. But when you get right down to it, like it's a tough discussion to have sometimes because like we know we need clean energy because we know climate change is offing species left and right, but we also know that wind turbines are incredibly hard on bats. I don't remember what the numbers is, but it's astounding the number of bats that wind turbines take out every year. And so there's this balance, and so this discussion has come up, like what's the value, and then where do you put in restrictions to protect these species that we know we have locally? So where is that value? And that's one of the just questions I've been having in my head is I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you bring up a really good point that like there can be these things out there that we may never see one. Like when I was there, I did a bunch of research, helped with the research on those endangered bats, and I don't think that I've ever seen one. My wife is lucky enough to have been part of the team at Central College that trap bats, so she
Oh,
got to
cool.
hold them. But like, yeah, how do you put a value and like how do you weigh out that difference in value, that monetary value of something like wind energy versus the value of an endangered species?
Yeah. And I recently wrote about this in my monthly newspaper column, but it was in relation to eagles because, January is always a big month for eagles down here along the Mississippi River. There's a lot of the communities, ours being one of them, have, eagle days. And my department puts on an eagle watch. They do a program and then they drive up to the lock and dam, which always has open water. And so when it gets really, really frigid cold, the eagles just stack up there. And I mean, there might be hundreds of them on one of those Saturday mornings where they go up and look at them. And and that's cool. And we all know the story. We celebrate the story of the recovery of the bald eagle and how back in whatever it was the 60s, they figured out the DDT was having a major effect on eagle populations because it would soften the eggshells, and reproduction wasn't happening the way it needed to, and populations were declining. And I think we were down to like, I don't know, 400 breeding pairs in the entirety of the United States. And the country kind of rallied around that, and that was right about the same time Rachel Carson's book came out, Silent Spring, and I got to looking at that. It's interesting. She was vilified a little bit back in the day. Like today we celebrate her as a conservation hero, right? But at the time, and mind you, she was battling breast cancer at the time. But there was a secretary of agriculture that questioned publicly why a spinster with no children was so concerned about future generations. It was shit like that that has some familiar tones to some of the political and just way people communicate in public spheres these days, or certainly online. And so it's kind of interesting to read about that, and how entire like the industries came out, and they questioned her science, and they're like, this is fake news, this is bad science. And then they started turning to, like, well, if you ban DDT, the entire agricultural economy is going to collapse, and all this stuff. And it's and meanwhile we're like, oh, we gotta save the eagles, and like, okay. And so and I'm sure the question was asked, maybe maybe not openly, but I'm sure the question was asked at the time, like, okay, if all the eagles went away, like if we didn't have eagles anymore, if bald eagles ceased to exist on this planet, the way the passenger went, the way of the passenger pigeon, would we be worse off today for it? Like, they
Right.
just, you know, like, if I go down to the river and never see an eagle, does my quality of life change measurably? And I I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that I mean, my life isn't, I wouldn't say, any worse today than what it would have been had we managed to keep the passenger pigeon around. But I don't know this because I haven't been around when the passenger pigeon was around. And so,
Right. There.
it begs, like if all the Indiana bats cease to exist, like if they do, and it's very likely in our lifetime that they will cease to exist, like they will be wiped off the face of the planet. Or the spotted owl out in the west. There's this whole, I don't know if you've heard about this, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to use like billions of dollars to basically shoot barred owls because they're taking over spotted owl habitat. Spotted owls are very endangered, and so that's super controversial. And so, like if these species just, they go away, what's the problem with that? And I'm asking this
Right.
facetiously, obviously.
Right. I think it does bring up a good point that, like, there are these things that, like, we don't know. We still don't fully understand the, like, ecological ramifications of the passenger pigeon being wiped off the planet. There's some people that think that it used to have this, like, relationship with bur oak trees, and some people have even gone so far to say, like, why are we managing for bur oak savanna when we have this, like, species of passenger pigeon that's no longer even a part of that ecosystem? Like, it's thought that they came in such, like, heavy waves that they would actually break branches off of oak trees, and that might be the reason that bur oaks are so good at healing over branch wounds,
Mm.
is actually has, like, this relationship with passenger pigeons. And then they actually also think that sometime, like, these years when we have really high numbers of acorns that are dropped, it may have been in response to passenger pigeons as well. But, like, we don't know all of those connections because they're gone now. And
Yeah.
so, like, even though it's difficult to think about a world without bald eagles or Indiana bats, like, we don't, if those things cease to exist, we don't even fully understand the ecological damage that it could inflict.
Yeah. And so I guess there's a different measure of value. Like there's got to be some sort of intrinsic value to these things being here. And there's got to be this recognition that we don't know the full ramifications of our actions, and or our inaction. If we fail to protect these species that we are doing a really good job of wiping off the face of the planet, uh, then what's going to be the implications of that? And frankly, we don't know, but we don't like uncertainty, you know.
Right.
And I think that's why we like putting values on things, because if you can put it in dollars and cents, that gives you certainty. Math is fairly certain. Like, if I can put a measure on it, and getting back to this wind turbine thing, developers can buy take permits, which will allow them to, take so many species, I guess. And I don't fully exactly know how that works. I'm really trying to get a hold of someone at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that can maybe join me on this podcast, because I'd really like to have a discussion of, like, okay, what is the process when a proposed wind or solar system comes into a community, and, like, what does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service do, and what's the process? And so I don't fully understand all of this, but I've been in these meetings and supervisor meetings, because our county supervisors have been it's been like a 9-month process rewriting the county renewable energy ordinance. And a lot of people have come in and said, well, the developers can just buy all these take permits and kill as many eagles as they want to. And so obviously there's a value put on them, and if we look at the hunting world, if somebody goes out and poaches a white-tailed deer, somebody somewhere can put a value on that thing. Like, here's your liquidated damages for this deer. And, like, we really like being able to put dollars and cents on things, but that's not how nature works.
Right.
And so I guess that brings me, to the overarching question of this whole episode here is like, how do we then, as conservation leaders, how do we communicate that intrinsic value? How do we communicate that a species has a right to exist just for the sake of existence, and not be vilified as, some tree hugging hippie the way Rachel Carson was? Um, and maybe there's no way around that. Maybe we don't get our cake and eat it too. Maybe you do just have to be vilified as a tree hugging hippie if you're going to stand in front of a county board of supervisors and say Indiana bats have a right to exist, regardless of whether we want wind turbines or not. So I don't know. What's your thoughts on that? How do we make that? How do we communicate that?
I think a thing that comes to mind for me is that we have to be willing to tell the story of those that cannot tell their own story. Like, I think it's amazing hearing the stories of the people in your community actually coming out with like binders of like, this is why Indiana bats are important. This is all the information on Indiana bats. And to think that it was only probably, I guess it would have been around the time of Big Hollow Lake being built in that 2008 time era, like, it was almost unknown that you even had bats in your community.
Yeah.
So then to go from that of like this, like, well, we kind of have some bats that maybe use Stars Cave, and then to start to learn that you have an endangered species in your community that has continued to go down and down and down, and tell that story to a place where you have people coming out and actually fighting for that species. Like, if the conservation board had not been there and had to do this research when building the lake, this wind turbine may just be happening, and there wouldn't be anybody even there to fight against it because no one would even know that you had this thing. And so I think it is up to us, the people in the know and the people who kind of have that knowledge, to be able to go out and tell our story of those awesome things that you have in your community, and tell that story for those who can't tell their own story.
Yeah, you touched on a good point there. Is that local knowledge, I think, is incredibly important, and that was one of the things that I think we did right down here in this ordinance, is that there is a section in this ordinance that gives the county conservation department, it requires the county conservation department to review the monitoring and mitigation plan that any developer has to develop ahead of being issued a county permit to do their development. And this will give those with the local knowledge the ability to look at, because obviously the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is going to require some sort of upfront monitoring. There's this whole tiered system that they follow. You do a desktop review, and then you do some on-site reviews, and depending on what you find, that maybe triggers the next tier and that kind of stuff. It gives the locals with the intimate knowledge of the local community and the local wildlife the ability to look at this stuff and be like, okay, did they do enough to determine what's actually out there? Because we know 3 miles away at Big Hollow Park, we have Indiana bats. Like, we have the acoustic monitoring data from last year that shows they were there in the middle of summer. And so maybe therein is the somewhat of an answer to the question, rather than getting up on the soapbox and touting your horn. Maybe it's putting effort into being that local expert. It's taking the time to learn what's out there, to try to understand the ecological community and the ecosystem around you, and what exists in those places, and whether that's driving around with some binoculars. Like, we got some guys that do that all the time. In fact, I walked into the nature center today, and there's this guy with binoculars over one shoulder, and then the other shoulder he's got this ginormous lens camera. Like, the lens was like 2 feet long. I don't know what he was photographing back there in the woods, but obviously. And so it's people like that us as conservation professionals should get to know. Like, if they walk into our nature center, be like, hey, what are you getting pictures of? Can I see your pictures? Well, man, that's amazing. Can you share those with me? Can we put those on our Facebook page? Can we tell that story of those things that can't tell their own story? And
Right.
our conservation department's a total staff of 8 full-time people. We don't have the capacity, the resources to know everything that there is out there, but we know the birders, so we know the guys that can probably tell us whether there's this neotropical migrant that comes through on March 17th every year, or we know the local herpetologists, even if they're amateurs. It's just the people that have interest in this stuff. And so I guess, maybe there's Maybe that's a good angle. There is just making sure that we're building that community and tapping into that network of people that would know what's out there so that we can tell that story.
Yeah, for sure. I think, on our neck of the woods and on our team, part of our thoughts is that being a good steward of the land is actually being like having an intimate knowledge of the land and us just like taking the time to go out and be like, all right, what species are coming up this year? Or where can we take out some trees here to reconnect prairie? Or maybe like this prairie needs some grazing, or maybe we need fire here. But having that intimate knowledge so that we can then actually take that and tell that story of the whole, and then also recognizing, like you said, that there are places that we may have gaps in our knowledge, and we may be able to do things like at Hitchcock, we have raptor banders. So we have a banding station, and we have people up on the tower that are doing surveys for raptors. So we just put up a MODIS station so that we can track
Oh
the
yeah.
bird migrants that are coming through. Like finding those things that, like you said, I think that is a great angle to really tap into the local knowledge of the people around you, and then taking like that next step. And that thing that we really need to do is to make sure that we're also telling that story that we get from those people so that we can show that these things really do matter. These things that we're doing do matter, and it doesn't have to be a dollar and cents thing, but it can be this telling this whole story of the things that are out there that call these places home, and that they matter just because of what they are and that they exist.
Yeah. Yeah, as you're talking, I'm kind of going through my head like, okay, how do I bring this full circle and bring this back to how do we put a value on things or is the way we value things wrong? And I think through all this, the thing that keeps popping up in my head is that Leopold quote, and we have it up in the upstairs of our nature centers. The objective is to teach the student to see the land, to understand what they see, and I think it's to love that which they understand. And so maybe through that, through cultivating that connection to the land, like you talked about, I think before we hit record was, you guys are cutting out this fence line. What's the ROI on that thing? But getting back to that bigger why of existing to connect people to the landscape and to get them to learn on the landscape and see what a healthy landscape looks like. And again, that's coming back to then they begin to value that stuff which is hard to put a price tag on.
Right. I think that
Yeah.
the rest of that story, it's been a really, really cool project for us that we have part of Hitchcock so Hitchcock so far has been like 12 different purchases. And a part of those 12 different purchases are different land ownership histories and like these straight lines that humans drew on the landscape. And so like those straight lines usually involve a fence line. And so this project that we're working on right now is actually trying to stitch back together those pieces of prairie by removing those fence lines and removing the trees that have invaded from that fence line. And so now we're getting to this place where, historically when you're hiking at Hitchcock, you're hiking up on tops of the hills, which is where a lot of the remnant prairie is. But then a lot of times you still have these trees below you. And if you're down in the valleys, you can't really see to the top of the hill. And so there's kind of this breakdown in that connection of seeing it all together. And now in this area, when we're done with this project, you can actually you can hike at the top of the hill and you can hike at the bottom of the hill and actually see it all reconnected and actually see like the things that make the Lost Hills super cool, like the cat steps in the side of the hill, those like wind-blown loess deposits and the way that they've been held in time by prairie. Like you can actually see that now, and you don't have to like try to look through a fence line anymore. And so it's going to have this extra layer of connection that people can have with not only Hitchcock, but the Lost Hills as a whole.
Hmm.
Like the whole Lost Hills have been so invaded by trees that it's hard to even see the topography anymore, because when you just have these trees that you're looking at, you can't see this grand view of what makes the Lost Hills so cool. It is the topography itself.
Yeah, two areas of benefit I see in that, and they're kind of interrelated. One is it allows people to see the landscape and not just the parcel,
Right.
and then kind of along with that, it allows management then to be more on the landscape scale and not just parcel by parcel. This is like that conversation I had with Chad Gravy. He talks about expanding the fire units so much so that you can light a fire and it isn't just bound by these artificial lines. You can actually kind of let the fire burn on this landscape, and you get this different intensities in different places based on the topography and the microclimate and that kind of stuff. And it more mimics the way fires were naturally back in the day. And so by opening that up, the project at hand is you're removing a fence line. Like, okay,
Right.
it's hard to put a price on that, but when you actually step back and look at the bigger picture, it's opening that landscape, and it's connecting people to a broader landscape and not just
It,
this confined little area.
and it's connecting like the species that we don't necessarily put a value on, like all of the insects that use
Right.
those prairies, and it reconnects a restored prairie to a remnant prairie and reconnects other sections of remnant prairie because of how this line was drawn. It's like up and over this hill, across this hill, down through this valley. And so it reconnects not only like the people to the landscape, but it reconnects the insects, it reconnects the plants, it reconnects like everything back into this prairie ecosystem and not
Mhm.
just this little footprint of a remnant.
Yeah. And so I guess to bring it full circle, we talk about a value of that which is natural, wild, and free. The reality for a lot of us though is we still have to write that into next year's budget, and we still have to put in the grant request or whatever. Um, and I guess it would be for me. It's looking at it from the perspective of the bigger picture and the smaller picture at the same time. Like the small picture is next year's budget, but the bigger picture is the generations of people that we're impacting here, or the species that we're protecting. And while that's hard to put a direct value on over time, it's immeasurable. And so communicating that, I don't know that I necessarily have a great way of doing it, other than you just relentlessly have to pound that drum and say, this has intrinsic value, and it was here before we came, and some of this stuff will be here after we're gone, assuming we don't wipe it off the face of the planet while we're here. And so there's got to be something said for that. And if we can dedicate all those resources and restrictions, regulations to saving the bald eagle, why can't we put it towards saving the Indiana bat or whatever else it is, the remnant prairie species in the Loess Hills, or even just the wetlands in Des Moines County. It doesn't have to be this big thing. It could be this little parcel of land, or it could be that trail that you're taking the kid on. That's their only interaction with nature. That's the only way they're going to get to develop that appreciation and value, not from a dollars and cents perspective, but value from an intrinsic perspective, that which is wild. And that's what we do. I guess that would be my encouragement to anybody listening is don't ever stop doing that.
I think it really connects back to a previous episode of your vision is your selling point.
Mm.
And so having that vision that we're talking about, like our vision here is stitching that prairie back together and reconnecting those prairies. And one of your visions over there is to continue to have these spaces and to manage for these spaces for these endangered species, these endangered bat species. And so when something comes up against that vision, like potentially if you completely surrounded Big Hollow with these windmills, like that's counterintuitive to that vision. And so just being thoughtful and continuing to tell that story so that others in the community can recognize the value of having bats on the landscape. And if you're going to do this energy development, to at least do it in a thoughtful way and to not have a negative impact on the thing that you're trying to protect.
Yeah, and you hit it on the head right there. It's doing it in a thoughtful way, and it's just being mindful of what's out there, and I mean, everything has an impact. It's just I don't know what something law of thermodynamics, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, right?
Right.
And so for every windmill you put up that's producing clean electricity, it's probably killing some bats too. or some birds in the process. And so how do you then strike that balance? Because everything that we do as parks people, as conservation people, everything we do is some sort of balance. And so if we can just be knowledgeable and be willing to share the stories for those things that can't tell their own story, I think that's all we can do as leaders, as conservation people. And we just do that as best we can. So I think that's a good place to stop our philosophical discussion for the day. I don't know we necessarily solved any of the world's problems, but it's a way of looking at things. And sometimes I like just kind of riffing on looking at things in different ways. So, all right, let's take it on out of here, folks. We have some interesting stuff coming up. If you are a member of the Next Level Leadership community, you have already gotten an invite to the next 2 meetups. The first one is with Dr. Kathleen Allen. She wrote the book Leading from the Roots, I think it's called, and talks a lot about taking lessons from nature and applying those to leadership and organizations, something that I'm pretty fond of. And so I'm looking forward to having that discussion. And that is coming up later in February. And then the second week of March, I think it is I think it's March 20th, right on the first day of spring. We are talking with Dr. Nick Askew. He is from the UK, and he is the director of Conservation Careers, and he is the host of the Conservation Careers podcast. He talks to wildlife managers from all over the world and gets their perspectives on what it's like working in wildlife conservation from around the world. So we're going to get to have a conversation with him. He and I are actually trading podcast spots, so I'll be on his show. He's going to be on ours. If you're a member of the Next Level Leadership community, you get invites to come join us for these conversations. So if you're not already a member, go to parksandrestoration.com and just give us your name and email, and you'll get these email invites, and we will be sure to get you invites to those. We've got more in the works. I'm planning on having a discussion with the Great Outdoors Foundation, talking about foundation operations. We talk about putting price tags on things. We're all up against some tight budgets and stuff, and I know foundations play a critical role in a lot of what we do. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation with them. And then got some other things in the works too that aren't fully fleshed out yet enough to be able to announce them. But so yeah, be sure to go to parksandrestoration.com, join the Next Level Leadership community, and get those invites to this fun stuff that's coming up.
And don't forget to find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. We'll be pushing out some information on those on those meetups as well. It'll direct you right back to our website, and make sure that you get signed up for that Next Level Leaders community.
All right. And with that, we are out of here. Thank you, listeners, for what you do out there, whether you work in conservation, in city parks, or you're just something parks adjacent, or you're just interested in some of the stuff we talk about. We do appreciate everything that you do and being part of this conversation. And we will talk to you again in a couple weeks. Take care.